For 15 months, from February 1990 to May 1991, Patricia Tkachuk undertook an in-depth study of Irish nationalist and Irish Republican life in Belfast. What she discovered was an amazing diversity of people on both sides of the peace walls, all living their lives in adjustment to the turbulent circumstances that surrounded them. This is the story of one of the fascinating people Patricia met, Celtic artist Phil McKeown.
I first met Phil McKeown in 1990. At the time, she lived in a mixed area of North Belfast. She was a devoted Catholic who, through her commitment to doing whatever she could to improve the well-being of stray animals and her readiness to offer help to any person in need, was well respected and liked by her neighbors, Protestant and Catholic alike. A teacher and a poet, Phil McKeown was also recognized by the National Irish Visual Artists Library as a highly regarded Belfast Celtic painter. Through her art, she struggled to make sense of the troubled environment in which she was living. During the late 1960s through the 1970s, she produced a number of small paintings, such as this one that she called The Destruction of the Irish Catholic Child. This early painting was inspired when Phil was visiting at a home in Ardoyne, a small Irish Republican area in North Belfast in 1969. This was a period when many homes in mixed areas, or near interfaces between the Republican and Loyalist areas of Belfast, were being burned as a violent attempt to physically separate populations holding different political visions of Ireland. This was also the year that CS gas, or as it is more commonly called, tear gas, was first used in nationalist and Republican areas of Belfast. In the house was a young girl, and as the family and Phil all sat in the living room, the face of a soldier appeared behind the lace curtain. What struck Phil at the time was the innocence of the child inside and the violence happening outside. When the painting was being done, she told me, the mask of death had just appeared on the canvas between the child and the soldier, behind the black rectangle, representing bars lying across the face of the child and the face of death. Clarifying, she said, the mask of death was not a preconceived image, but rather came out of the painting process itself. In her art, Phil often related that she just let the paint form its own image, and then she developed it. The violence of the period was further emphasized by the image of fire reflected in the red border of the painting and the CS gas canister located in the top center area of this red border. The broken brick effect on which the images were painted, Phil said, were actually there as the house was in ill repair. The Celtic designs were of her own creation and adopted as her personal signature. Phil told me that the huge painting she saw by the Spanish artist Picasso impressed her and shifted her focus from the small paintings she had done, such as the destruction of the Irish Catholic child, to painting large murals that followed ancient Celtic painting techniques. She explained that the Celtic way of painting was to absorb all the designs and then interpret them in the artist's own way, and also to use materials that were all alive at one time. For example, hide, hair, wood, sacking, even the paint itself. Her desire to understand what was happening around her through her art turned to frustration in 1978 when she was asked, along with two others, to paint a government-funded mural on the wall of the youth club in Ardoyne, and told that she could not include anything too Irish, out of the club's fear that this and any future funding might be jeopardized. not an uncommon fear at the time among Irish cultural groups, nor always unfounded. Instead, she was to do a sports scene of footballers, which she compliantly did, and while this mural had been popular locally, she later told me she hated it because of the Irish content restriction. After this experience, Phil's artistic expression disappeared from public display and emerged on the walls of her home, where she employed ancient Celtic painting techniques to produce a large mural of her vision of Ireland's history, that being one of human sacrifice. As Phil explained, in 1968 to 70, I was painting a few small things, the things upstairs, but I had never done one that was absolutely symbolic of the Irish question. And I thought of the Irish question and that I would do something for my grandchildren to have that would be a complete culture of the day. The first thing I thought of was the ancient Aztec people, who I had read about in the Golden Bough. So the original idea of blood sacrifice, actually human sacrifice, came from the ancient Aztec Indians, who believed that unless human hearts were sacrificed every day to the sun, it would not rise again. I fell to thinking, is that how it is with Ireland? A god or goddess who must have a blood sacrifice, human hearts? In Ireland, so many hearts are sacrificed a day. This idea of blood sacrifice, which Phil admitted she did not fully understand, became the overall theme of the Morrigan, a 12 by 14-foot mural that she started in 1981 at the height of the hunger strike in Long Kesh prison. The Morrigan became the first and only completed mural of her intended blood sacrifice trilogy. Relating how this mural was connected to the 1981 hunger strike, Phil told me, the idea of the Morrigan had come to me before the 1981 hunger strike, but when the 1981 hunger strikes happened, the mural was happening too. And that was why I went to the hunger strikers' funerals to find out what need does human sacrifice take. When I asked her if she ever found an answer, she replied, no, these men were sacrificing themselves for a principle. It wasn't for freedom, but I guess it was, in a way. It was so odd. They were prepared to sacrifice their lives for a principle. That I couldn't come to grips with. And there were a lot of people willing to make this sacrifice, and there were a lot troubled about it. I remember one woman talking to me about it. I don't remember her name. I know her to see. And she was very troubled about it because of the religious angle as well. And I said, no greater love has man than when he laid down his life for sin, which is what they were doing, you know. And I comforted her a bit. It was an awful time because it was an extremely long night. You dreaded it. You had the radio on all night. He's dying now. Who's dead now? How many must go? It was so morbid. It was so horrific. Life was rocketing by under the eyes of people, literally. I sure waited to hear each night what was happening, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one. I mean, every morning I dreaded turning the radio on, and then I dreaded turning it off. You found yourself turning it on every half hour. Who's dying now? They were dying. It didn't make sense. I asked, what about the people in the streets? Did they talk about it? She responded, no, most of them didn't. One woman mentioned it to me once, and she said they were brave. And I said, yes, there was tremendous bravery and loyalty. And she said, yes, but they are committing suicide. And I said, but you remember, you could say that about anyone who puts themselves in a dangerous situation. You could say that they are committing suicide. Christ, you could say he committed suicide if you look at it from that angle, you know. He didn't want to die. They didn't want to die, but they had found themselves in a position that there was no other way. The same as Christ. He found himself in a position that there was no other way. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but it's still a human sacrifice. Man still wants to sacrifice himself to the Spirit. It's a pound of flesh for the new emerging man. To sacrifice yourself so that man will have a better life. You have to repent with flesh and blood, appeasement. It goes back to that every time, and that is my obsession with human sacrifice. I asked her if she saw the Irish struggle that way, and she replied, "Oh yes, my God, how many hearts go a day? It doesn't matter what religion we are, what sect, whether they are IRA, UDA, or whatever. They are sacrificed on street corners, in barns, in jails. They die every day. There's hardly a day goes by when you don't find somebody has died. Who doesn't know death?" Then I asked Phil if she would explain how she created the Morrigan and the symbolic meanings she used to convey her vision of Irish history as one of human sacrifice. She began saying, "When I started the Morrigan, I was using wood. I never could afford leather. I had to make do. I had made a pledge that nothing but the best would do this time. And I used the wood, everything that had been alive, the wood, the hair, and the hide. Nothing human but the hair. It was the closest I could get to human sacrifice, and the hair was very important. There was a time in Ireland when the Catholics or nationalists, whatever you like to call them, were not allowed to have their hair long. Penal laws prohibited men to have long hair, and this was the closest thing I could get to human sacrifice. I had read that book in this period, The Golden Bough, and the hair was very important. It was magic. And I read that the Spanish, when they were leaving, they exchanged pieces of hair, and it was used for spells. And the importance of these scalps hanging in the Morrigan, they are actually hair. It had to be real. I cheated at one stage. I couldn't get the color I wanted, and I thought it had to be a certain color. It had to be red hair. I went to the shops everywhere to find red hair, and I hunted down people to get red hair, and I couldn't get it, and I had to buy a bit. But even then I found it didn't please me, so I cut a bit to get it as red as I could. And this is very hard to do when it's already done, you know. Here Phil meant when she said that the hair has already been done, that the hair was already bound when she bought it. She continued, "So I cut it in two, and I dyed a bit of it. It was real red then. I wanted it red because of him. It was because of Kenny. He was the one who had a tumor on the brain and the one who the soldiers beat, and then he died within a very short time. Someone had told me that he had had red hair, but this turned out not to be true, but I wanted it red because of him. I also wanted one of the hunger strikers' hair. I wanted the hair of somebody like Bobby Sands, but I missed that. They wouldn't let anybody near him, you know, so I didn't get any of his hair. And at the time I thought to myself, God, I wished I had had the courage to ask, because by that time their hair had grown terrifically. Anyhow, I did get one of the hunger strikers' hair, and it's on that wooden plank at the top of the mural. When I asked her if she knew which one belonged to the hunger strikers, she replied, "Oh, God, yes, I do know. And I had an awful time getting it done, because the hair takes a lot. It is an art craft to bind them, you know, but I got there. And that makes people's skin creep sometimes, if I tell them that. But I didn't tell anybody. I never told anybody one of the hair pieces was from a hunger striker, because it's got to be a unit. And there's room on the wooden beam for more scalps, Ireland's future sacrifices." Next, Phil spoke directly of the wooden beam across the top of the mural, saying, The wood was alive at one time. Everything there used for the mural was alive at one time. Even the holes in the wood that were made by insects, the insects were alive at one time. Phil then went on to tell me that the wooden beam took many weeks to prepare because she had to chop it with an axe so that it had the violence of Ireland imprinted on it. Phil continued, I used a lot of rock coloring because I used it all the time, used rock that you get from the earth. The red in the mural, that actually comes from little insects. The paint is actually made out of insects. It is insect-based. The paint you can only get in England from the government. Browns and reds, beautiful colors. And I use these colors because they had been alive at one time for a reason. It had been sacrificed for the peat, and the wood had been sacrificed for the beam, and the hide was sacrificed because the animal had been eaten. The materials had all been proud and alive at one time, and they were all sacrificed. Phil told me that she only used differently shaped pieces of hide when she was painting the Morrigan, and she usually just painted one image on each of these odd pieces of hide that ranged in color from dark to light. When I asked if there was another reason for using the hide, other than that the animal had been eaten, she responded, yes, there was actually. The hide, I think it was about the 11th century, that hide was used for the last time as painting material. I got the hide from a man who made special shoes from leather. He would save hides for me. I didn't want perfection, odd pieces. And he knew about shoes and he knew about leather. And I told him I was doing this art thing, and I told him what I wanted. And every time I went down, I declare, he would say, I have something for you. And I didn't want it to be cooked. I wanted to use it without cooking it. It was so beautiful, all those different shapes, but I didn't want it to be cooked. And the only piece that was sent away for me was the leather I used for the Morrigan, and this had to be cooked. I just could not get the fine, kid-like quality of leather I needed otherwise. So they sent some pieces away for me. They were very good to me. I didn't want perfect. Then Phil began to describe each of the symbols she used in the mural and how she saw them individually and collectively as symbolically portraying the history of Ireland as human sacrifice. Oh yes, she said, the Morrigan goes back a long way in Ireland. The Morrigan is a symbol of destruction in Ireland. She could appear in any form she wanted. She could appear as a beautiful woman, or she could appear mostly as a crow, a carrion thing. And there is a story about if you let her in your house in the guise of a beautiful woman, then there is destruction. She is a symbol of destruction, a symbol that had destroyed an entire culture or tribe. So the mural became the Morrigan, and she's in that painting as a crow, and on her head is a crown. Had I put a symbolic crown, that may have been better. It often worries me that I had put the British crown on her head, and it worries me because it was false. And I went and got a picture of the British crown when I painted it that day, and I wanted it to be clear that overall the troubles of today were caused by the British government. To me, the Morrigan with the British crown on her head has overshadowed the entire history of Ireland. At this point, the discussion returned to the meanings of other symbols in the mural. She said, the first symbol I picked, if you are familiar with symbols, was a stone. There is a stone, an ancient stone, the sacrificial stone at Newgrange, and these strange symbols were on it, and I reckon it was from the days when they worshipped the sun, and they put a Celtic design from that time crudely on this stone. And the historians discovered it was a sacrificial stone used by the Druids, human sacrifice. So I started from there. It's on the upper left-hand side, and it's on a complete skin of its own. Then I painted the heron, the sacred bird of Ireland. The heron was goodness in opposition to the Morrigan, that is seen as a crow. The heron is on your left, the bird you can't see very well. Her wings stretch straight across, disappearing behind the Morrigan. You see the oval on the left, with her legs coming down. You wouldn't really know she was a bird when you're looking at it. You have to look for it. What else did I have in there? It's that long ago now. Oh, yes, the war symbols that are on your left and on your right. These are my idea of Celtic war shields. Also, below the Morrigan is barbed wire, which represents the blood sacrifices of today, the hunger strikers and all the others who have been sacrificed for Ireland. And it goes right down to the bottom, to penal days. The penal cross is also symbolic of the Christian era, and both are symbols of human sacrifice. And at the time I was painting, I thought, they couldn't count the penal era sacrifices. The penal crosses were then, and at the very bottom is a black bar, which is symbolic of today. And both the penal crosses and this black bar symbolically represent all the people who were prepared to let themselves be sacrificed. And that is the history of Ireland, and the human sacrifice continues. It never ends. A second large 12 by 14 foot mural that Phil simply referred to as St. Francis, and which was to be part 2 of her blood sacrifice trilogy, adorned another wall in her home. A lot of work had been done on this mural when I saw it in 1990, and it was still not yet finished when I left in May 1991. Phil, however, had fully worked out why St. Francis was important to include in her blood sacrifice trilogy and its relevance to Ireland's history as human sacrifice. She explained, "I started St. Francis when I was still working on the Morrigan, and St. Francis came out of a promise I made to him when I realized that I could paint something that had never been seen before." He came from wealth. His father was a silk merchant, and his mother was from nobility. I mean, his father came from Mount Etna, and in his youth, St. Francis was a happy, bright young spark, and God knows what else. And he gave all this up and traveled the country as a beggar. And I was appalled to learn that somebody in the Falls had called him God's jester. The crosses at the bottom, they just appeared. Then I wanted it to look like a medieval banner. I wanted it to look like he was a standard. He was the standard bearer of Christ, and I wanted people to see him as one, because at the time, when he lived, he was seen as a buffoon. And I thought, St. Francis and the birds, everyone has painted that. But I thought, if I painted St. Francis as a fool, that would be different. But I knew I had to do it in such a way that it was right. I still can't find the right hat for his head. And there was only one drawing of him. He was a lovely man with ears that stuck out, and people thought he looked like a fool. At first I painted him without ears, then with small ears, but they still don't please me. It's my fault the mural still isn't finished. I paint on an annual basis when I paint, but I never got it right, not yet. Then I asked, "You told me your murals were to form a blood sacrifice trilogy. How did St. Francis fit into that?" Responding, she said, "He walked. He sacrificed himself as an example of Christ's poverty. Remember what it was like then. The monasteries at the time were going away from their original principles, Christ-like principles, like poverty, real poverty, not just like symbolic poverty, but to actually live it. And because he made the sacrifice, he is one who actually received the stigmata. He is one of the few recognized as a stigmatic, and therefore he was a human sacrifice for a principle." Finally, I asked, where does the third piece of the blood sacrifice trilogy fit in, the one you call the crucifix, and the one you have not yet started? Phil replied, "As I was telling that priest, I forget his name, about my work and its theme, the human sacrifice, he said that Christ made the supreme sacrifice. The first treachery God was given was when he gave them the 10 Commandments, and they couldn't stick to that. Even Moses, every one of them made deviations away from it, and they still wanted to sacrifice human lives. He wanted it stopped, their human sacrifices, to stop all this blood and horror. That is the most important thing. And he gave his son. He sacrificed him. And they still continue to sacrifice. Then I asked, how does the crucifix fit into Ireland today, the blood sacrifice and Ireland? Phil replied, it still fits in with every sectarian murder. Let's have the blood. Ian Paisley said, I didn't like him, but he said he wouldn't stop until the Belfast streets ran with Papist blood. He said that in the 60s. I have seen them, his followers, getting their buckets ready, and him still going on a torrent against Rome. They see the Pope as the Antichrist, and they vowed to wipe out the Irish culture, that is, to wipe out the people. And the human sacrifices in Ireland still remain.